Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for calculating the cost of IT downtime this afternoon. My name is James Watts, and I'll be running through the session. So let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about. Before we actually get into the content of this session today, I just want to run very quickly through the agenda and how we can communicate for questions, etc. So we are scheduled today for this webinar to last 30 minutes. Now that is including a Q&A section at the end of the session. Please, if you have any questions, type in. You've got a section on the right-hand side. Pop those questions in. I won't be able to answer during the session today, but I'll do my best to go through as many as is possible at the end of the session. And if there's anything that's missed, or if there's anything that I'm not able to answer today, I shall endeavour to get back to everyone individually. Or, as often is the case, if there's some really good questions that are worth sharing with everybody, we'll pop them up on our blog and let everyone know about it. And I'd actually like to also add a plea today. So rather than just questions, I would also like to ask if you have any, as we're going through these calculations, if you have any comments, if you have any feedback or suggestions, but most importantly of all, if you are going through the process of doing your own calculations at the moment and you'd be interested to discuss, please let me know. I'd love to have a conversation. Later this year, we at DataBarracks are going to be launching a project around cost of downtime because, interestingly enough, it's an area that I think a lot of people struggle to find real figures from businesses who have calculated this and are happy to publish themselves. So it's an ongoing project. Please get in touch. We'd love to discuss with you. And so to run through the content for today, we have a number of points here I've got on the right. So the first thing we're going to be doing today is using a very simple cost of IT downtime calculation. Hopefully that'll be really easy for everyone to use. And from there we can build out, so we can then use that calculation to work out costs for individual departments, costs for specific systems or combinations of systems. And then we're going to look at what the longest length of time for an outage you might be able to suffer without any kind of cost, and equally how you can quantify some of the supposed intangible costs. In particular, this is things like reputational damage. Now I want to make a couple of notes here. I've got a couple of starred sections at the bottom of the slide. So because of the nature of what we're talking about today, there are a lot of calculations we're going to be going through. Don't feel you need to be scribbling down all of these. If there's anything to take notes on, then obviously please do so. But the slides will be available following the session, rather than waiting for this to be asked as a question, as usually the case. I want to let you all know that now. We'll pop those out to you either later today or early tomorrow with a recording of this session. So if there's anything you need to see, you can go over it again. And equally, we have an interactive PDF, which is the cost of IT downtime calculator. So this is a PDF that you can go into, you can put your figures in, and it'll perform the calculations for you, which I'll give you the link at the end of this session and in the email, so you can actually get all of these figures yourself. So let's start. What does downtime actually cost? Now, before we talk about our own calculations, I thought it would be a good idea to start with a couple of figures from some industry experts. So I've got a few here. We're going to start with Gartner. So Gartner have estimated downtime can cost $5,600 per minute, which is around $300,000 per hour. The Poneman Institute, who have actually done some really good research on data center outages, they've quoted this being $740,000 per outage. And that's the figure from their latest research in 2016. So they've done research into data center outages in 2010, 2013, and 2016. Interestingly, that's up almost 50% from the figure in 2010. So over 6 years, it's gone up from around $500,000 to almost $750,000. Again, so similarly with these resources, I've included the links here, but I'll include them tomorrow when we pop those emails out. And then I wanted to include this last figure at the bottom here. So this is a figure from, it's an industry body, so it's the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the body that regulates our law firms and solicitors. And this is nice for a couple of reasons. I think firstly, it's great to have a figure that's actually in pounds sterling rather than US dollars. But good to see a body who have given a figure for their industry specifically. So their figure is that downtime can cost a business losses of up to £10,000 per hour and up to £1 million of a full business day is lost. Now, The thing with these figures, terrific as they are, and I've no doubt they're accurate, they're great when you're looking at an industry as a whole, but they're a little bit useless if we're thinking about our own businesses and we want a figure that is usable for ourselves. So that's what we're going to be going through today. Now, before we get into that, I want to look at why this has become such a hot topic, why it's becoming something that we're talking about a great deal more, and why we're seeing the cost of downtime increasing. Now, the big headline reason for this, and I hate using this term, but it's digital transformation. It seems to be the buzzword du jour at the moment. Everyone seems to be asking the question, do you have a digital transformation strategy? Which I don't like, but I think it's a good description for the process that all businesses have been going on for probably 20 odd years now in terms of the automation and digitization of processes that we go through. We are all far more productive now than we were 20 years ago. We can do far more, and that's because of the technology that we're using. And that's really, really terrific. I don't think anyone would, out of choice, go back to those manual processes that we went through a long time ago. But equally, if we look at our business day to day versus how it was 10 or 20 years ago, when we previously used to suffer some sort of IT incident that would create an outage, there were other manual processes that we would go and do instead. There were paper-based processes. Those are fewer and fewer these days. So we have an increased reliance on technology for automation and for being productive. And as a result, it means when those systems do go down, there is a greater cost to us as a result. And then because this isn't just something that's happened to us individually, it's happened to all of our suppliers and all of our regulators, there is now an increased expectation from all of us to have a greater level of uptime. So it's become something that's really, really important for us all, which is obviously why we're talking about this today and why you're here and interested in it as a topic. Before I give you the first set of calculations, I want to set out our stall and just be firm on a couple of definitions that we're going to be using and we're going to be consistent with throughout the session today. So the first thing I want to talk about is the downtime itself. So what do we mean by a system being down? We are not talking about a system that might be performing sluggish. It might be not performing optimally. I think that's a different topic. What we're talking today is about a system being 100% unusable. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you as a business or perhaps a department would be 100% ineffective, but the system itself is completely down. So that's the first point to get through. Secondly, on downtime as a concept is the time part. So when you're using a calculation for downtime, we can use any unit of measurement that we might choose. If you're in financial services, if you're in e-commerce, you're probably going to talk about a very, very short period of time indeed. It might be a second, it might be a minute. Other businesses, we could be talking about days worth of downtime before these figures become interesting. Now, the figure that we're going to use consistently throughout the session today is an hour. It's one that we really like because you can scale it up and down quite nicely. You can multiply it by 8 to get a working day, or 24 to get a full day, and it'll scale up quite nicely across any number of the calculations we'll be using. And I hope you'll agree with that. If not, then obviously please pop those suggestions in the question box. So the last point of each of these definitions is cost, and we're going to be breaking cost down into 3 separate sections. So the first is staff costs. This should be pretty straightforward. You pay your employees to do a job. If IT systems are down and they're unable to perform those jobs, there is obviously a cost there. The second point is fines or penalties from your regulators or your suppliers. This obviously depends on the industry that you're in. If you're in a highly regulated industry, you're likely to suffer from more penalties. But for everyone else, something that is becoming increasingly common as we're involved in a one link in any kind of supply chain is a requirement from our suppliers to meet certain service levels to them. So for instance, if you are part of a distribution channel for a large retailer, there is almost certainly going to be a financial requirement for you to be delivering what you say you'll be delivering on time for them to do so. And if your IT systems are out, it will probably impact your ability to do that. The last point in cost, this is the big one, this is the one that we think about a lot, and that's the loss of revenue. So if you are down, money is not coming into your business. And I want to make a quick point here about the indented bullet point here, which is reputational damage. Now, often that's something that is included separately. I want to make it very clear that when we talk about reputational damage, we are only ever in this case going to be talking about it of how that impacts loss of revenue. If we leave it as an intangible, it becomes something that's very difficult to dictate any decision making. So I certainly want to include it there, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. So let's start then. This is the very first calculation we're going to do. These are the really simple calculations for cost of downtime. And I want to say, first one we're going to use is turnover divided by the number of hours in the year is going to give you a loss of revenue per hour. So really, really straightforward here. How much money do you make? How many hours have you got in the year? This is how much money you're making per hour. And the figure itself there is 8,760 for the number of hours in the year. A bit blunt perhaps. So for those of us who are only in business during working hours, that isn't particularly useful. We're only taking revenue in during those hours. So the cost of downtime for us at 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning is obviously not the same as the cost at 2 o'clock in the afternoon today on a Thursday. So the turnover of your business divided by the number of working hours in the year gives you a loss of revenue per working hour. Nice and easy. On the other side, we have our staff costs. So we take our cost of staff. We always want to divide that by the number of working hours in the year. Whether you're a 24-hour business or not, you will know the number of hours that are being worked by your staff, and that's going to give you a cost of staff per hour. Now, if we take those two figures and we add them together, what we get is a really simple cost of downtime. Now, this is probably too blunt an instrument for most businesses to be using. If not, if this works for you, terrific. You can drop off now and get on with other things this afternoon. But these are good figures for you to start with because they really help inform the other calculations that we're going to be doing today. So the one thing that I'm really keen to do with each of these calculations is to try to bring it to life a little bit with an example. So for this really, really simple calculation, the first example I'm using is a legal or professional services firm with a turnover of £10 million. So if we take these figures that we've just been using, for a £10 million turnover legal or professional services firm, we will have a loss of revenue of £4,808 per hour. That's based on working hours. And we'll have a staff cost of £3,606 per hour. Now, in legal and professional services, you generally have a relatively high proportion of your cost is on salary. These are knowledge workers. The vast majority of that cost is on paying those people who are doing a job. So the cost that we get here is £8,414. And when I popped these figures in, I was surprised by how close it actually ended up being to the figure that was given by the SRA. I think probably more down to chance than anything. But here's our first example, and we'll be using a few more as we go through. So, as I mentioned, that's a relatively blunt instrument to use that as your cost of downtime calculation. We probably want to be a little bit more nuanced. Now, one of the main reasons that you will do these calculations, that you want to work out what downtime is likely to cost, is so that you can get a good idea of what is a reasonable amount of money to spend to prevent that happening. So, in doing so, I think in looking at these in slightly different ways, there's some good tips that come out as to say, actually, it will tell you which departments or which sites or which IT systems are the ones that cause the biggest issues for you in terms of cost, and lead you in terms of where you should be investing that money. So if we look at calculating the cost of downtime for a department, we literally start with our staff costs. I've done this the other way around because I think it's a more useful way to look at it. So we start with staff cost, your total salary cost for the individual departments, usually a relatively simple figure for you to find, divided by the number of working hours in that year, you've got your departmental staff cost. Where things become slightly more tricky is you look at the revenue lost per department. So again, nice and easy, we can take that loss of revenue per working hour that we worked out previously, and then we need to multiply that by the proportion of revenue that is contributed by that department. Now, this means that we need to make some judgments and some estimates on how much revenue is contributed by department. There's an important proviso here that if we're working out this based on a percentage, that those percentages must add up to 100%. If we don't do that, then you run the risk of overestimating a calculation there for revenue. You'll say, actually, we're losing lots of money because of the loss of our sales team, and equally the same for a marketing team. And so we take those two figures, we add them together, and what we get is our total cost for a particular department. So I think I'm going to highlight this with another example. So example 2, we're looking at the HR department in a £100 million turnover engineering company. I just want to flag here, I'm fairly pleased that we're using some unconventional industries here for looking at cost of downtime. I think probably most people are normally used to looking at e-commerce firms or financial services when we talk about cost of downtime, but I think that can skew things. We're looking at hopefully some nicer real world examples that perhaps will apply to everybody. And the department I've picked is the HR department, which is my go-to favorite for whipping boy of cost of downtime being nothing, because as much as we all appreciate that the HR department is incredibly valuable for the long-term success of any business, in terms of direct revenue contribution for an hour or a day's worth of downtime, there's actually none that comes in. So the easy thing that we can say here is there is no lost revenue down to that department being unable to operate. And then we can work out a cost for that department's staff cost. Now, this is based on some examples of £100 million turnover engineering firms we know here in the UK. So at a total salary cost of around £225,000 per year, that's £108 per hour. Now, I think this is a really interesting example because it leads you to say, actually, at that figure for a business of that size, it's quite easy for you to discount any kind of recovery contingency plan for a really, really short-term incident. So hopefully this will lead us, we'll come on to some other examples in a second. Now, something else I want to add quickly on this point is that actually what many businesses might find, I mentioned that when we look at those individual departments, the total figure for all of those departments needs to add up to 100%. You might find the case that actually all revenue generation comes through one department. So in fact, when you're looking at revenue generation, there is only a single department that you really need to focus your attention on in terms of revenue loss. In terms of productivity and staff cost, that's a different question. But it isn't uncommon for you to say, actually, all of our revenue is generated by a sales team or the e-commerce team, and other costs, other departments aren't responsible at all. So moving on from the people in the departments, we're now going to look at the individual systems. So again, we'll start with a simple figure here. You can take your simple cost of downtime. Now, as a quick reminder, that is the combined cost of staff and the loss of revenue. We can multiply that by the productivity reduction due to that system being down, whether that's an email system or a finance system or a CRM system. And what we get here is a cost of downtime per system per hour. Again, starting with a really, really simple calculation, but this is one that I would say definitely don't use for a couple of reasons, and let me show you why. So firstly, if we're talking about an individual system, unless we're talking about something that is used by the entire organization like email, there is a very high likelihood that that system is only used by a single department. So actually what we want to be looking at here is the departmental staff costs. It could be one department, it could be several departments. Now the second point that I want to raise here is that actually the productivity reduction can be different. It can be different in terms of how it affects your staff productivity, and it can be different to how it would affect your loss of revenue. Now, I appreciate that can be a slightly difficult concept to work through looking at these calculations, but I think it's probably well illustrated in the following example. So example number 3, and I've got 3A, so 3B will be following, because we'll hopefully be able to illustrate this. We're looking at a £250 million turnover charity here, and first of all, I'm looking at here the loss of 2 systems. We could choose to have one system. We could say you're losing your VoIP system or you're losing your email system. But I think actually you could quite easily make the argument that for a lot of businesses, if you lose one of your communication channels, it would only have a relatively small impact on your productivity because you would just switch over and communicate with people through the other channel. So for this example, I wanted to say, right, we're losing both of those systems. So for this business, we're looking at a loss of revenue of £28,538 per hour. Now, this is on the basis that the revenue for that charity is split evenly over every hour in the year. We're considering that donations could be coming at any time, so we're not talking about just working hours here. The staff cost, on the other hand, we are looking at for a working hour. So staff costs are £4,807 per hour. Now that's based on 40% of expenditure for that business. So the simple cost of downtime per hour is £33,346 per hour. So a productivity reduction due to the system outage of 20%. The cost of downtime per system, or systems in this case per hour, is £6,669. So as you can see, kind of relatively straightforward to get that calculation, but I think probably it's not accurate enough, and I want to illustrate this through the second example. So again, we're talking about the same charity, the same figures in terms of loss of revenue and staff costs, but the system we're talking about here is the fundraising system. So if you were to lose a fundraising system for this particular charity, we will make the case that you would lose 100% of the revenue. There's no way for that charity to process any revenue coming in. So for that hour, all of that revenue is lost. On the other side, in terms of staff productivity, it's going to have a reduction in staff productivity, but it's not going to stop staff from being able to do any part of their job. So in this case, the figure we get to is £29,500, and that's based on a big chunk of the impact coming in terms of loss of revenue, but only a relatively small impact of staff costs. So I want to take a quick look here, talking about just the single hour, is what is the longest outage that you could possibly handle without having any kind of cost? Because there is an underlying assumption that we have been working through in each of these examples so far, and that is that each hour of downtime is equal, which I think we all appreciate isn't, not just looking at seasonal demand or times when those systems will be needed most. Actually, losing just 1 hour of your system would only have a relatively small impact. I would certainly argue that for a lot of businesses, in terms of the staff cost, actually for an hour of downtime, there might be zero impact at all. Perhaps you're a business that has a lot of the team that will come into the office at 7 a.m. and leave at 7 p.m. They work really long hours. Or perhaps you'll have an hour of downtime, and it means some of the team will just take their lunch a little early and work around that. For an hour, you can probably make that up in a lot of areas of business. When that stretches out to become 3 hours, that becomes more significant. Then you've got work that needs to be made up, and then you've got work that needs to be done on top of that when you were making up that original work. So I think we know that firstly that time is different. Now secondly, the difference I want to add here in terms of what an hour of downtime means to different kinds of businesses. So in terms of loss of revenue, so here are two examples of businesses. So we've got the top left, we've got an off license and grocers, a little corner shop, and then we've got Airbus in the bottom right hand corner. Now around sort of this time of an afternoon, sometimes I'll be feeling low. I might choose to pop out of the office, take a walk up the road and grab myself a can of fizzy pop and a bar of chocolate, something as a little bit of a treat. And relatively often when I get to the shop just up the road, they might have a sign up that'll say back in 5 minutes. I'm looking for a product that is very easily replaceable, and there's plenty of competition. Now in this case, if that business isn't open for 5 minutes, I won't wait for 5 minutes for it. I'll walk a little bit further up the road and go to the next shop, to the supermarket, and pick up my treat. On the flip side of that, if we look at Airbus here, Airbus don't make quick sales. If you go to their website, there isn't any online shopping cart functionality there. If you're the kind of person who's making an order of 50 A350 aeroplanes, you've probably been wined and dined by their sales team for a matter of months. The sale of those aeroplanes isn't going to be derailed by 3 or 6 or 12 hours worth of downtime on a particular salesperson's CRM. And that's something else that we need to factor in here. It's there is a chunk of time which will mean we will lose business, and there is also deferred sales which will just come in slightly later than we would have had originally should that plan have happened. So that's obviously something that we need to include. And then kind of finally, on the point of costs here, I want to look at peripheral costs. So firstly, the one thing I'm not going to touch on at all today is fines from regulators. all suppliers, I don't think it's a good idea to include in a session like this, because I think they're only relevant to you. You will know what those figures are. The one that I do want to take some time on is quantifying the intangibles, and by that I mean loss of reputation. And the thing with loss of reputation is that it's actually very, very well recognized by most businesses. In a lot of cases, it's the single most frightening aspect of downtime, but it's the least well understood, and mostly because people don't take the time to understand what impact that would have on revenue. And so there's a kind of simple thing that we like to do here, is to say, right, actually, if you were to suffer a small outage, so you might say that could be an hour for you, it could be a day, what would the impact be for you? Would you lose one customer? Would one customer say, I've been so upset by the service that I've received from you, I'm not going to do business with you anymore? If so, how much impact would that have, and what would that cost be? So I'd say perhaps you might want to say that would be the impact of losing one of our average sized customers, or potentially you might say 5% of your average sized customers. Conversely, you would then want to look at a really, really long outage and what would happen. And I think sometimes the one of the best ways to kind of sharpen the focus of a business is to say, what would happen if you lose your largest customer, which is the thing that terrifies most businesses. So I think we can assume there is a period of time that an outage would, if we had an outage for that length of time, we would lose our largest customer. Work out what those figures are and put those in, because once you have those figures, then it becomes very easy to factor in and make some slightly more interesting calculations. And that's one that I want to come back to now. So I'm coming back to the original example of the £10 million turnover professional services firm. So they had a cost of downtime of around just under £10,000 per hour. So looking at those figures for a day's worth of downtime, you're looking at around £67,300. If we look at longer periods of downtime, we need to start factoring in peripheral costs, whether they are fines and penalties or whether they're the loss of customers in future. So at a week, we would say that loss of revenue and loss of salary has increased pretty significantly, but there is a peripheral cost that we need to factor in. If you were to suffer 2 weeks of downtime, we're now looking at a very significant peripheral cost, and we have to realistically consider what is the survivability of that business for the potential loss of reputation that would be occurring. And I do want to add, this is perhaps you might think actually a 2 week period of downtime is unthinkable. That's something that doesn't happen anymore. It does happen. It absolutely is the case. Incidents occurring related to cyber incidents at the moment, for instance, are frequently taking this sort of length of time for you to be able to come back from. So certainly worth thinking about and factoring in for longer term planning. So as we're kind of coming to the end of the session today, I want to run through a few factors and things to consider and work in. So first of all, one of the important things to consider is what proportion of your costs are down to salary. This will play a big factor in terms of your staff costs versus your incoming revenue. How seasonal is your demand? This is something that we've barely touched upon today, but is obviously really important if you're in a business that has far more incoming revenue at certain times in the year. The one recommendation that I would have is that actually probably what you should do is use all of these figures but produce two sets of figures, one for your peak period and one for your least busy period. Something to consider is how many of your sales would be deferred and not lost. Sometimes it's easy for businesses in our position here to say actually it's all doom and gloom, you would lose lots and lots of money. Isn't always the case. Some sales would simply be deferred, they would be pushed back. You would have a poor week's performance one week, but that would increase the following week. And then finally, obviously, what we haven't talked about at all today is to work out the cost of your own regulatory penalties. So if you remember nothing else from today, cost of IT downtime is increasing, and therefore it needs to be increasing in your awareness in your activity. But IT downtime doesn't necessarily cost anything, and the most important thing you can do here is obviously to quantify all of those supposed intangible figures. So we are actually bang on time. I'm afraid we're not going to have time today for any of the questions. I will I'll work through the session here, and I've promised to get back to everyone. And I'll fire across all of these resources, but there are a few things I just want to point out before we close off today. Here are the links to each of the stats that we use today for downtime. The link to the cost of downtime calculator will include here, so you can click on that and go to when we send these slides out later today. And if this has been interesting to you, we've recently launched the Business Continuity Podcast. So the first episode is up and live. You can subscribe to that on iTunes or go to thebcpcast.com. And the second episode will be being launched later this week. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I've been James Watson. I look forward to speaking with you all again soon. Thanks.